My name is Alara, and at 73 years old, I have learned that the quietest rooms often hold the loudest truths. For most of my life, I lived in the gentle, unassuming shadow of my husband, Arthur. He was a history professor, a man of books and quiet contemplation, and I was his partner, the keeper of our home, the weaver of the simple, sturdy fabric of our days. We lived in a modest cedar-shingled house in a quiet neighborhood of Port Blossom, a city that hugs the coastline, perpetually smelling of salt and rain. We raised our son, Mark, there, and believed we had instilled in him the values we held dear: kindness, integrity, and the quiet strength of character. When Arthur passed away 3 years ago, I thought the deepest silence I would ever have to endure was the absence of his footsteps on the old hardwood floors. I was wrong. The silence that followed, the one that grew in the space between my son's family and me, was far more profound and deafening. "She's not your real grandma." The words, spoken by my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, were not shouted. They were delivered in a stage whisper, a conspiratorial hiss meant only for the ears of my 8-year-old grandson, Leo. They drifted from the living room of the rented lake house, across the screened-in porch where I sat watching the evening mist curl over the still, dark water of Heron Lake. The air was cool, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Leo had been showing me a trail of ants marching with heroic determination along the porch railing, his small face a mask of intense concentration. He looked up, his brow furrowed with the pure, uncomplicated confusion of a child. "What do you mean, Mommy?" Vanessa appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the warm light of the cabin. She held a glass of white wine, her posture a study in casual condescension. "I just mean she's your daddy's mother, sweetie. Not like me, part of our immediate family. It's a bit different." She took a delicate sip of wine. "We're just here taking care of her for the weekend, you know? It's what families do for relatives." The casual cruelty, the careful placement of that final, distancing word, should have pierced me. For 3 years, similar words, similar sentiments, had felt like 1,000 tiny cuts. But this time, something else bloomed in my chest, something warm and solid. It was the feeling of a final, heavy piece of a puzzle clicking into place. It was certainty. A smile touched my lips. Not the fragile, polite smile I had perfected to deflect their pity and impatience, but a genuine, knowing smile that rose from a deep, hidden wellspring within me. In that well, I had carefully collected every dismissive glance, every patronizing comment, every moment I was made to feel like a liability. For 3 years, I had been conducting a quiet, painful experiment, playing the part of a destitute widow. And tonight, Vanessa had just handed me my final, conclusive data point. "Alara? What are you smiling at?" Mark, my son, emerged from the kitchen, his voice laced with that familiar tone of weary irritation. He had his father's height but none of his quiet strength. Vanessa didn't mean anything by it. "She's just tired from the drive." He always made excuses for her. He had to. It was the only way to reconcile the woman he had married with the mother who had raised him. He'd made excuses when Vanessa suggested my treasured china was too fussy for family dinners, serving me on chipped stoneware instead. He'd made excuses when she'd forgotten to invite me to Leo's school concert, claiming it would be too much trouble for me to get there. He'd looked the other way as she slowly, methodically, edited me out of their lives. "Oh, I know exactly what Vanessa meant," I said, my voice soft but clear, carrying easily across the porch. "And it's perfectly all right." Leo, abandoning the ants, scrambled onto my lap. His small arms wrapped around my neck with an instinctive, unconditional love that felt like the only true thing in the world. "You're my real grandma, Nana. The best one." His fierce loyalty was a balm to my soul, and it nearly broke my resolve. But then I saw Vanessa, over Leo's shoulder, roll her eyes with theatrical exasperation. Even this, a simple moment of affection between a boy and his grandmother, was an inconvenience to her. "Leo, honey, come inside and wash up." "Dinner's almost ready," she commanded, her voice sharp. "And don't get your shirt dirty on that old cushion." The cushion in question belonged to a weathered wicker chair, my designated seat on the porch, just as the lumpy pull-out sofa in the living room had been my designated bed for this family vacation. I had paid for the lake house rental, a sum that would have made Vanessa's perfectly coiffed hair stand on end, but I had let Mark take the credit. It was all part of the performance. As Leo reluctantly slid off my lap and trudged inside, I remained on the porch, watching the sun bleed its final colors into the lake. The quiet hum in my pocket was a text message from my financial advisor and attorney, Mr. Davies, a man of impeccable discretion. All preparations are complete, Alara. Are you ready to proceed? I typed back a single word, tonight. The plan, meticulously crafted over months of observation, was finally ready. But first, there was one last supper to endure, one final act in my long-running play of the poor, dependent widow. Inside, Mark was setting the table while Vanessa complained about the small kitchen, the limited spices, the general hardship of preparing a meal for four. I took my seat. She served a simple pasta, giving herself and Mark generous portions, Leo a child-sized one, and placing a noticeably smaller, almost symbolic, serving onto my plate. "There's more if you want it," she said with a bright, false smile that didn't reach her eyes. The unspoken message was clear: elderly people have smaller appetites. Don't be greedy. Mark was already lost in his phone, his habitual refuge from any potential conflict. It was a trait he'd learned from watching his father, who would retreat into his books whenever my sharp-tongued sister-in-law visited. Some family patterns, I mused, are as persistent as genetics. "Nana," Leo piped up, his mouth full of spaghetti. "Mommy says we might not visit your cottage as much. She says gas is getting really expensive." I felt Mark stiffen beside me, a flicker of shame crossing his face before he buried it again in his screen. Vanessa shot her son a look that was pure venom. "Well, sweetheart," I said, choosing my words with care, "sometimes circumstances change. People have to make choices they believe are for the best." What I didn't say was that after tonight, the cost of gasoline would be the very least of their concerns. Everything was about to change. Everything was about to become honest. The rest of the meal passed in a tense silence, punctuated only by Leo's happy chatter. I treasured each word, each innocent question, storing the memory of his uncomplicated joy. As Vanessa cleared the table, clattering my plate with unnecessary force, I excused myself and returned to the porch. The air was colder now, the scent of pine sharper. Tomorrow, the masks would fall. They would learn who they had been dismissing for 3 long years. I thought of the $48 million portfolio, the real estate assets, the quiet empire I had built while they saw only a lonely old woman in a tiny cottage. Most of all, I thought of Leo, and the crucial lesson he was about to learn about respect, integrity, and the true, unshakable meaning of family. The smile returned to my face, real and full of a quiet, liberating power. Tonight couldn't come soon enough. I woke the next morning on the lumpy pull-out sofa, my back aching, but my mind serene. As the cabin began to stir with the sounds of Mark making coffee and Vanessa directing Leo's morning routine, my thoughts drifted back to how this strange chapter of my life had begun. Arthur and I had lived a life of deliberate simplicity. While he shaped young minds with tales of empires and revolutions, I was quietly building one of our own. It began with a modest inheritance from my grandmother, a woman who had taught me the value of $1 and the power of patience. I studied the markets. I read financial reports with the same focus Arthur gave to his historical texts. I invested in fledgling technology companies when they were little more than ideas in a garage, in overlooked parcels of land that I knew would one day be valuable. We lived on Arthur's salary, banking every penny of my investment returns. We drove old cars, clipped coupons, and mended our clothes, not from necessity, but from a shared philosophy. Wealth, like a great tree, grows best in silence and shadow. When Arthur passed, our net worth had blossomed to just over $40 million. I sat in our quiet, empty house, a queen reigning over a secret kingdom, and felt utterly alone. 2 weeks after the funeral, Mark and Vanessa sat at my kitchen table, their expressions a carefully calibrated blend of sympathy and impatience. "Mom, we need to discuss your situation," Mark had said, avoiding my eyes. "Your financial situation," Vanessa clarified, her tone brisk. "Mark says Dad didn't have much in the way of savings." You won't be able to afford this house on your own. I let the silence hang in the air, a silent invitation for them to show me who they had become. We found a lovely senior community, Vanessa continued, pulling a brochure from her purse. It's very affordable. You could sell this house, and the money from the sale would cover your expenses for quite a while. Affordable. Translation: a place they could put me without feeling too much guilt. Sell the house. Translation: liquidate my life so I wouldn't be a financial burden. In that moment, the test was conceived. Instead of revealing the truth, I played the part they had written for me. I agreed to everything. I sold the house, transferring the deed to a holding company I owned, and moved into a small cottage in a less fashionable part of town. The cottage was another of my properties, but I let them believe I was struggling to pay a modest rent to a demanding landlord. The rent is so high, I'd sigh on the phone to Mark. But I'm managing. His calls grew shorter, less frequent. Vanessa's invitations to family gatherings dwindled, replaced by excuses. We don't want to put you in the awkward position of not being able to afford a hostess gift, she'd explained once, with breathtaking condescension. I played my role with the dedication of a seasoned actress. I wore the same few cardigans until they were threadbare. I spoke of sales at the grocery store. I gave Leo handmade gifts for his birthday, apologizing for not being able to afford the latest toys. And all the while I watched. I listened. I documented. The most painful part was not their neglect of me, but what they were teaching Leo. He was learning that love was transactional. He was learning that Grandma Alara was a person to be pitied, a problem to be managed. Nana can't come to your soccer tournament, honey, I'd overheard Vanessa telling him on the phone. It's a long drive, and I don't think she can spare the gas money right now. I could have chartered a private plane. Instead, I sat in my quiet cottage and grieved for the moments they were stealing from me, from him. Vanessa framed it all as compassion. She was protecting me from the stress of trying to keep up. In reality, she was airbrushing me out of the family portrait, one casual slight at a time. Mark, my gentle boy, simply allowed it to happen. He's busy with school, Mom, he'd say when I mentioned Leo's growing distance. It's normal for kids his age. But it wasn't normal. It was the result of a deliberate, calculated campaign. And when Vanessa had told Leo the first wasn't his real grandma, she had provided the final, irrefutable proof. She wasn't just sidelining me, she was actively trying to sever the bond between me and my grandson. Now, pushing myself up from the lumpy sofa, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in 3 years. I pulled out my phone and checked my portfolio. The market had been kind. $48.7 million. More than enough to secure Leo's future. More than enough to rewrite the rules. In the kitchen, Vanessa was pouring cereal. She glanced up as I entered. "Sleep okay on that thing?" she asked, a dismissive flick of her eyes towards the sofa. "I slept like a baby," I said, smiling brightly. "I feel more rested than I have in years." She didn't know it yet, but in a few hours, she'd be the one having trouble sleeping. The thought was so satisfying, I almost laughed out loud. The day passed in a haze of strained politeness. We decided on a walk along the lakeshore. I, who had been playing the part of a frail woman for 3 years, set a brisk pace that surprised them. "Nana, you're walking so fast," Leo said, his little legs turning to keep up. "I feel wonderful today, my love," I said, squeezing his hand. "Sometimes we have more strength than we realize." Mark looked back, a puzzled expression on his face. "You seem different, Mom." "I am," I said, and left it at that. At the water's edge, Leo began his ritual of collecting perfectly smooth, flat stones for skipping. Mark and Vanessa set up their portable chairs, fussed with their phones, and took a series of selfies, carefully framing me out of every shot. For 3 years, I had been the ghost at the feast, a spectral presence in their curated family memories. The realization no longer stung, it was simply another piece of data. Leo soon tired of their self-absorption and trotted over to me, his pockets bulging with stone treasures. We sat together on a fallen log, away from the others, and for a blissful hour, we were just a boy and his grandmother, building miniature stone towers and inventing stories about the family of ducks paddling by. This was the currency I valued, these unscripted moments of pure connection. He's really attached to you, Mark observed, finally looking up from his phone. It's sweet, Vanessa added, her tone suggesting it was anything but. Though we have to be careful he doesn't become too dependent. It's important for children to learn that people can't always be there for them. She was preparing him for my eventual, managed disappearance from his life. I met her gaze across the small stretch of beach. Family should always be there for each other, I said, my voice quiet but firm. That's what family is for. A flicker of unease crossed her face. Well, yes, within reason. We all have to be realistic. Oh, I agree, I said, smiling a smile that made her visibly uncomfortable. It's very important to be realistic. That evening, I made my move. I'd like to make dinner tonight, I announced as we packed up to leave the beach. A special meal for our last night. Oh, Mom, don't trouble yourself, Mark said quickly. We can just order a pizza. I insist, I said with a cheerful finality that brooked no argument. It's the least I can do to thank you for this wonderful trip. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. My performance had just gone off script. The kitchen here is barely equipped, she protested. Don't you worry, I said, patting her arm lightly. I'm far more resourceful than you think. That night, I transformed the tiny, inadequate kitchen into a gourmet haven. I had made a trip to a specialty grocer in the nearby town that morning, a place where a single cut of fish cost more than their weekly pizza budget. I prepared a wild-caught coho salmon with a dill and lemon butter sauce, wild rice pilaf with toasted almonds, and asparagus roasted with parmesan and garlic. The aroma that filled the small cabin was one of warmth, luxury, and subversion. I watched their faces as they took their first bites. Shock, followed by confusion, and finally, dawning suspicion. Mom, this is unbelievable, Mark said, his fork pausing midair. Where did you learn to cook like this? I've always known how, dear, I replied sweetly. You just haven't been paying attention. Vanessa was eating slowly, her mind clearly racing. This salmon must have cost a fortune, she said, her voice a little too casual. I got a wonderful deal on it, I said, meeting her gaze. Sometimes, you just get lucky. Lucky, she repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. I set down my fork and took a deliberate sip of the expensive Chardonnay I had also purchased, a stark contrast to the cheap boxed wine I usually contributed. Actually, I began, feeling the atmosphere in the room shift and crystallize. I think it's time we had a talk about luck. And money. And honesty. Mark froze. Vanessa's hand tightened on her wine glass. What do you mean, Nana? Leo asked, looking from one tense adult face to another. I mean, my sweet boy, that sometimes the stories we believe about people aren't the true ones. I turned my gaze to Mark and Vanessa. For the past 3 years, you have both been operating under a significant misunderstanding about my life. Your situation? Vanessa's voice was thin. My financial situation, I clarified. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a slim tablet, swiping it on and turning it to face them. On the screen, in bold, clear numbers, was the summary page of my portfolio. Total assets, $48,731,562.14. Mark's jaw literally dropped. A piece of asparagus fell from his fork onto his plate with a small, lonely sound. That's not possible, Vanessa whispered, her face draining of all color. Oh, it's very possible, I said, my voice calm and even. The investments, the real estate, the trust accounts, they're all quite real. The only thing that wasn't real was the poor, helpless old woman I've been pretending to be. The silence that descended was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air from the room. Pretending? Mark's voice was a choked whisper. You've been performing? I've been conducting an experiment, I said, the words falling like stones into a deep pool. A 3-year test to see who my family truly was when they thought I had nothing left to give. The silence shattered. Vanessa shot to her feet, knocking her chair over with a crash. You lied to us. For 3 years, you've been lying to us. This is monstrous. Is it? I asked, remaining seated. I simply allowed you to believe your own assumptions. I didn't force you to treat me with pity and condescension. I didn't ask you to slowly push me out of my own grandson's life. You did all of that on your own, when you thought no one of consequence was watching. We took you on vacation, she shrieked, her carefully constructed composure in tatters. You warehoused me, I corrected, my voice cold. You managed me like an unpleasant task on your to-do list. And yesterday, you told my grandson I wasn't his real grandmother. You weren't just dismissive, Vanessa. You were cruel. You were actively trying to poison my most precious relationship. The word poison landed like a slap. She staggered back, a hand flying to her throat. Her breathing grew ragged, her eyes wide with a mixture of rage and pure, primal panic as the full implication of her actions, set against the backdrop of that number on the screen, finally hit her. I think I'm going to be sick, she gasped. And then, in a moment of sublime, unexpected drama, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she crumpled to the floor in a dead faint. Mark rushed to her side, calling her name, while Leo stared, his eyes wide with shock. I remained at the table, calmly took another sip of my excellent Chardonnay, and savored the profound silence left in the wake of her collapse. Is Mommy okay? Leo asked, his voice a small, frightened tremor. She'll be fine, darling, I said, my voice softer now. Sometimes, the truth is just a little overwhelming. Mark looked up at me from the floor, his face a canvas of disbelief, anger, and the first terrifying glimmers of understanding. What happens now? He asked. I smiled, a sad, weary, but resolute smile. Now, I said, gesturing to his unconscious wife, after Vanessa wakes up, we finally have an honest conversation. Vanessa came to a few minutes later, sputtering and disoriented, to the sight of Mark kneeling beside her with a damp cloth. Her eyes found me, still sitting calmly at the dinner table, and the horrified realization that it hadn't been a bad dream washed over her face. Mark helped her into a chair. She sat rigidly, her hands clenched in her lap, avoiding my gaze. I need to understand, Mark began, his voice strained. You let us believe, you watched us. Why? Because I needed to know, I said simply. When your father died, I looked at the family we had become, and I didn't recognize it. I needed to know what was real. Would you love me when it was inconvenient? Would you respect me when I had nothing to offer? The answer, I'm afraid, was no. But if you had just told us. Vanessa burst out, her voice cracking. Told you what? That I was wealthy. I leveled a look at her. And what would have happened then, Vanessa? You would have been a model of filial devotion. You would have insisted I take the master bedroom. You would have included me in every family photo. Your kindness would have been a performance, an investment. I wasn't interested in buying your affection. I was interested in discovering if it existed at all. The truth of this pinned her to her chair. There was nothing she could say. I reached into my handbag again and pulled out a thick manila envelope, placing it on the table between us. This changes everything, I said. I have made some new arrangements. I pulled out the first document. This is my revised last will and testament. My entire estate, all of it, will be placed into a trust for Leo, to be managed by Mr. Davies and a corporate trustee. He will not have full access until he is 30 years old. Vanessa made a small, strangled sound. You're cutting us out. I am protecting my grandson's future from people who have demonstrated questionable character, I said plainly. However, there are conditions. The trust includes provisions for his education and well-being before he turns 30, but those funds will only be dispersed if he is allowed to maintain a full, free, and loving relationship with me. If at any point the trustees determine that you are obstructing that relationship or poisoning him against me, the entire trust will be immediately dissolved and its assets donated to the Children's Hospital. That's blackmail, Mark whispered, aghast. No, I said firmly. It's a firewall. It's a consequence. You spent 3 years teaching my grandson that I was disposable. You will now spend the next decade and a half proving to him, and to me, that I am not. I slid a second document from the envelope. Furthermore, I am moving. The cottage you so disliked was one of my properties, but I've purchased a new home. It's a lovely place with a large garden, about 2 hours north of the city. 2 hours. Mark's voice was filled with dismay. Yes. Far enough that visits will have to be intentional. No more dropping by out of obligation. If you want to see me, if you want me to be a part of your life and your son's life, you will have to make a genuine effort. You will have to earn it. I looked at them, my son with his face in his hands, my daughter-in-law looking utterly broken, and I felt a deep, profound sadness. I had not wanted this war, but I had been left with no choice but to win it. You have a choice, I said, my voice softening slightly. You can accept these terms and we can begin, slowly and carefully, to build something new and honest. Or you can refuse, and you can spend the rest of your lives knowing that your pride cost your son a future of immense opportunity. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark, silent lake. I'll be leaving first thing in the morning. I suggest you use the night to decide what kind of people you want to be. The drive home the next morning was silent. Mark had approached me on the porch as the sun was rising, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a shame so deep it was painful to witness. We accept, he'd said. All of it. And, Mom, I am so sorry. I failed you. You failed yourself, Mark, I had told him gently. But now you have a chance to be the man I know you can be. 6 months later, I was kneeling in the soft soil of my new garden. The afternoon sun was warm on my back. Beside me, Leo was carefully watering the basil seedlings we had planted together. The Trower Drive had become a bridge, not a barrier. Mark brought Leo to see me every other weekend. The visits were filled with laughter, cooking, stories, and the slow, steady work of mending what had been broken. Vanessa came sometimes. She was polite, cautious, and visibly uncomfortable in my presence. The warmth between us was gone, perhaps forever, but it had been replaced by a grudging, necessary respect. It was enough. Nana, Leo said, setting down his little watering can. Mommy said you're very rich. Is that true? I smiled at his beautiful, honest face. Yes, my love, it is. He tilted his head. Does that mean you're different now? No, sweetheart, I said, pulling him into a hug that smelled of dirt and sunshine. I'm exactly the same. The money doesn't change who a person is. It just reveals who they are. He nodded, accepting this as a profound truth, then his face lit up. Does this mean we can get a dog? I laughed, a real, full-throated laugh of pure joy. It means, I said, that anything is possible. As I sit here tonight, in my peaceful home, a cup of tea warming my hands, I feel a sense of quiet triumph. It's not a victory over my son or his wife, but a victory for myself. I learned to draw a line, to build a boundary of self-respect around my heart. I learned that sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for your family is to demand that they be their best selves. The test is over. The performance has ended. And I have never felt more real. I'm glad to have you here, sharing in my story. It has been a long and often lonely journey, and it brings me comfort to know it has reached you, wherever you may be. Please, comment the city you're watching from, so I can see the new connections being forged, a constellation of lights in the quiet dark.